our baby. Oh, here it is. Oh, he keeps turning his head.
Feeding baby Alexander is quite hard.
Watch this. Here comes the aeroplane.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Ooh.
we got him.
The Priority Pass system was first announced by Jeff Kaplan in a developer update in late 2020. This introduction was an attempt to even out the player-based distribution between the three roles in the game, after role lock in the 2-2-2 format was initially introduced to the game in August 2019. The system allows you to earn passes by queuing for all three of the roles, and then allows you to use these passes later on to enter a preferred queue for the role you're actually interested in. Entering this favoured queue essentially allows you to cut the line in front of other people. Not to the front, but at least 5 minutes in front of where you would have been if you weren't using one. It's a fairly simple system, it tackled a real problem, was fairly easy to implement, and so naturally was included and iterated on as a prime feature in the sequel. Well and truly evening out the roles distribution for good, and queue times were never bad again. Oh, that's weird. Wait a minute, where's the Priority Pass? Where'd it go? And why didn't it do anything? The Priority Pass was one of the most damaging systems ever to be released into Overwatch, and almost by itself managed to kill the game.
By entering a flex queue.
Okay, yeah, sure. It wasn't the Priority Pass. I mean, it wasn't just the Priority Pass. It kind of was the Priority Pass. The thing that killed Overwatch was obviously the conscious decision by Jeff Kaplan to completely abandon the game in lieu of working on his PvE project, which was clearly just Project Titan, wearing two trench coats standing on top of each other. Despite the game's abandonment for 3 years, games don't just die through being stale. And we only really had to last like a couple of years until Jeff Kaplan would come out with the sequel and wow us with all the PvE content. Worse things happen to franchises kind of every day. I'm not so crazy to think that a game without constant development and support can survive in this day and age, especially a first-person shooter with a 20 quid buy-in. But Overwatch did manage to die while the gaming space wasn't in a recession, but was in a massive resurgence made by COVID due to everyone being damn inside. And if there's anything that's going to make your game fall off faster, it's probably not being able to play the damn game. If there's ever been one aspect and one nail in Overwatch which the developers have repeatedly tried and failed to drive into the floorboard, it's probably role distribution and queue times. And these problems have clearly come back to bite them in the arse all the way up until today. With the trial of the 6v6 mode on the horizon threatening once again to double the demand on the tank queues, there's never been a more pressing time to lance this boil and stop us repeating the mistakes of the past. So what the hell was this system, why did it work, and how do you put to rest a thorn that's been in Blizzard's side for almost 8 years now?
So we're gonna try to get 1 million people right now to
tank
in Times Square. Show us what you got!
Let's get some tanking music on. Yeah.
Hold up.
Tank.
Baby, you gotta throw it. Come on, man. I wanna see the crowd. Get it going. You got it? You've been working. I'm like hitting my wife for you. God, so just move. If you gotta throw it, just move. It's all I wanna see some movement.
Priority passes are earned by entering a flex queue.
Oh my God. This is not that big.
Wait a minute, what did Ninja just say?
Working. I'm like hitting my wife for you.
Well, the logic is pretty simple to start with. Theoretically, we've incentivized players to play the role that has the least amount of players in it by getting them to queue for flex. There's no big brain things to analyze straight away, it's a fairly surface level thing. Certainly, even if this doesn't fix the queue time issues, it's probably going to help them a little bit, right? Well, no, the actual results of the system wasn't what was expected. It was actually a brief bump in the amount of people queuing for the tank role, and then a massive drop off over time like the system didn't exist in the first place. The actual problem was that the numbers and therefore the incentive setup were completely incorrect, and that led to a feedback loop of poor practices and bad actors within a community that really didn't need any excuse for more poor practices and bad actors. These player behaviours naturally bore down on the established tank player base like vines around a tree, and eventually left the tank role hollowed out and dead, supported only by the system which had killed it in the first place. And when that tree fell, it took out the rest of the game. So let's start here with the numbers. The system gave you 6 passes for a win in the flex queue, 1 pass for a loss in the flex queue, and you could stack up to a total of 40 passes on top of each other to use at a later time. The first problem is pretty simple coming out of this: queue saturation. If you give out 6 passive per win consistently, what ends up happening is the queue saturates with pass holders, and when the fast pass system becomes mandatory, we're really no longer rewarding players for flexing, but we're punishing players that didn't flex. Because of the saturation of passes, the 5-minute queue time became pretty damn misleading. The numbers stated as your expected queue time really weren't based off of anything other than the maximum unqueued time. And when the people that aren't in the priority pass get less than the people in the priority pass, this number gets a little bit arbitrary. But that's not really the main issue. Theoretically, 6 passes per game did make sense. In a very real way, you're going to be allowing 5 or 6 players to play the video game where otherwise they couldn't play it before. The napkin math does check out. But if the numbers swing to such a degree that you're guaranteed to get into the tank role by queuing for flex, and you were already one of the people that wanted to queue into the tank role, why wouldn't you just queue for flex, take the nominal like 1% chance that you'd be queued for support for a game, and take the passes for later? I'd argue that as a result of this, when people cottoned on to the fact that flex queue just meant tank queue, each game was probably giving out to the people in the lobby on average of 13 or 14 passes. The 6 passes in retrospect was a completely obscene number to be giving out, and therefore a very simple thing happened
Game while you're in the
Huh? Oh, come on! You gotta admit this is cool! Just like a movie! I'll give them
queue times.
I'll give them the most spectacular
Queue times.
anyone's ever seen! Everyone can be superheroes. Everyone can be super. And when everyone's super...
The second problem that arose instantly was straight from the numbers as well, and it was hoarding. So 40. Why 40? Well, I don't really know. I assume it's so that when you group with your friends, you can farm a couple of passes before you get into a group with them and never be without a pass at an opportune time. But depending on the type of player, some of the time the most obvious thing happened. People farmed to 40 passes, saturated their account with them, and then basically proceeded to never touch the tank queue again. At this point, the system wasn't working at all for at least a couple of types of users. The first player is a player that doesn't want to interact with the system at all. A very large majority of the player base only play the game to play the character they want to play, and when the queues got absurdly long, they didn't flex to tank, they just left the game or went on to other game modes such as Mystery Heroes. I mean, this did improve queue times. I mean, it's a least healthy way of doing it, but it did do it. DPS players were leaving on average. The second type of player, especially at the low ranks, didn't play the game for more than 16 to 20 hours anyway. They farmed for the first week like everyone else did, and then proceeded to use those 16 hours of gameplay over the next couple of months. And to be clear, these players are a sizable majority of the player base. 16 hours is a lot of time to spend on an online competitive game in one mode. And each one of these players working through their passes essentially created what I would call a queue debt, which means they were just paying back the time owed later. But it wasn't all bad, because 2 types of players definitely interacted with the system in a positive way. One group naturally trickled into the tank queue slowly to farm out the passes a little bit without maxing them out at 40, giving the role the desired kind of like stable stream of players into it. And the other group farmed passes until 40, naturally used all those passes because they play the game so much, and then had to farm more. You can even say that the last group and the players that play the game more were definitely the ones that we wanted to target, because they're going to be reducing the tank queues the most where it matters. But regardless of everything else, it's pretty damn clear that this system wasn't working as intended for everybody. The third major problem is also a number, not one of the ones I said earlier, but the SR distributions. When we went into role queue, players were naturally at a higher rank in their preferred roles, and as time went on, the disparity between the roles they play and the roles they don't play widened over time. 6 months into this kind of like specializing effect, role queue comes along, and the players who had previously been grinding Instalock, Hanzo or Torbjorn need some passes. So this created a couple of problems. When you force the players that are normally better at playing support, or more importantly DPS, into the tank queue, you've necessarily made Smurfs. This is fine and kind of like unavoidable, I guess. They aren't purposely smurfing, but due to playing the other roles, their passive skills, which are kind of like more easily transferable into the tank role, will have moved up in level, whereas their relative SR for the tank role wouldn't have been adjusted. But even if you think that just general smurfing isn't a bad effect, when you think about high-level Overwatch, the queue times for lower skilled lobbies are becoming more populated with tank queues, and that's happening at the expense of the queues in the higher rank lobbies. The reason why this wasn't accounted for is probably because the priority pass was released at a time that was only like 6 months after the role queue was introduced originally, meaning that the SR distribution and SR system in general was quite underdeveloped for the time. But that's still obviously not where the problems ended. We have a newly minted population of tank players. The majority of those have come directly from the DPS queues, and are almost exclusively just there to win.
Got it? You've been working.
So that leads to problem 4. Roadhogs everywhere, and not a drop to drink. That's right, it's a follow-up video. With this being the state of the ladder, I asked you very simply, who the hell enjoys playing the video game with a smurfing roadhog in your game? Certainly not the enemy tanks who are going to get hooked instantly and deleted if they ever drop their shield. Certainly not the enemy DPS who are going to be completely jeweled out of any angles by the roadhog. And certainly not the allied tank who is basically playing the game now in a format designed to break their mental. Hey guys, remember the Roadhog Zarya meta in 2020? That was a good thing. Do you know what I remember from the Roadhog Zarya meta? And I know it was played at the higher ranks for a little bit of time, but it was never really good, right? Not in ladder, it was never really good. When played in a relatively balanced match with Roadhogs that aren't smurfing, he's actually relatively easy to shut down in general. The problem was that we had so many Roadhog players and so many smurfing Roadhog players that we may as well essentially make a meta around that player. And if this comp does get mirrored, boy howdy do we have a terrible experience for everyone. It's no wonder people started locking Zarya and started just bubbling the hook to stop the enemy Roadhog hooking your Roadhog out of hooking the enemy team. And if you want to, well, actually me here about how the comp was actually played at a high level, everyone knows that Sigma Hog was actually the better version of that. The only reason why you play Zarya was, again, because you were playing it in the mirror matchup. But that doesn't defeat the point that the reason for this adoption on ladder was simply due to the massive amount of Roadhog players and people adapting to play around them. And I've already poked at it, but you know the argument if you've been paying attention at any point at all. Do you know the person that least wants to play the video game if Roadhog's meta and Zarya has to be played in order to pocket them? It's tank players. But we're still not at the bottom. So let's go to the 5th problem and the next number. 1. One pass you were awarded for every single loss. It's really easy to see why you want to award that 1 pass. It incentivizes players to queue for tank even when they're not feeling their best in terms of winning. It gives them a consolation prize so they don't feel like they've wasted their time in the queue, so they might queue again in future. And players are, by and whole, there to farm as many passes as possible, so surely they won't just go for the singular pass and will instead try their hardest in order to get the 6 passes. Right? Don't mention they're on Roadhog. Don't complain if they're on your team. Act like they're not there. I should be grateful that they bothered to turn up. All the losses are my fault and not the person who saw the word tank on Overwatch 4 and once when they were 12 and went with it. These players are just there to do you a service after all. They're top 500 damage, didn't you know? And you should be grateful that they're lowering themselves to diamond in order to allow you to play the video game. And if you're ungrateful for their kindness. Turns out that players playing their dump role with lower SR than their main role, who really don't have any pride in their tank role in general, when faced with a 1 pass penalty, which is still a net positive for losing, and really no additional downside, don't really care from game to game if they win or lose. After all, their goal isn't to win, it's to get the most amount of passes. The moment that they can rationalise that this was a lost game anyway, or maybe that they just don't like the cut of your jib, there's nothing you can do to actually keep them on your side. Obviously, this 1 pass given for a loss was clearly a travesty of massive proportions and a clear mistake, but we're still not at the bottom. There's more nails for the coffin. I said quite obviously at the start of the video that the priority passes created perverse incentives for players, and I've come up with a couple of examples of this already. But there's one last one here that should, if nothing else has, convince you of the complete failures of this system. One problem so obtusely massive that it beggars belief that it wasn't thought of and accounted for. Most players naturally have either a stable main role SR or a main role SR that's slowly increasing, because most people naturally don't have the time, patience, or the care to actually improve at the game. But their tank role, which naturally hasn't been adjusted to their skill level, that's a lot easier to raise. If you're a high tier player and you want to play 60 hours of DPS queue, which, let's be honest, ain't really that much for most players in a season, you'd need to farm, I'd say, about 150 generously passes. This for the tank queue is 25 games net won on average if you lose a couple in there. So the natural result is that you have to actually increase your tank SR by almost a skill bracket in order to be able to farm these passes. So here's the rub: as their tank SR gets higher, the advantage they get from the natural fundamentals in the DPS role get less impactful over time, as they are, de facto, just smurfing less and less. And especially for higher ranked players who already have their tank role reasonably high to begin with, things get harder a lot faster. Not only do they, on average, play a disproportionate amount more of the game than lower skilled players, meaning that they have more time in the tank queue and therefore are going to raise it up faster, but it's very simply easier to win a silver game with platinum DPS mechanics than it is to win a high diamond game with GM DPS mechanics. So these players have two choices. They either learn tanking fundamentals such as tempo, timing, cover control, angle usage, that sort of stuff, and commit mentally to picking up the tank role in general and learning the role in order to be able to keep climbing. Or we start fucking throwing, baby! Lower your tank roll gets, the easier it gets to farm passes. So why do you even want to win? The next loss just makes the next win easier. Farming 40 passes once as a DPS player just makes farming 40 passes again harder. And naturally you might even need to do this multiple times in one season. So why wouldn't you just soft throw or like sandbag the games where the entire team in your perspective is yelling at you and telling you to get off your hero? The games are getting pretty hard anyway, and every game that you lose gets you one step closer to easier games. And even worse to that, if you can sandbag games fast enough, there's even a good argument to be made that spending a few hours losing SR and then farming optimally might even be faster than it otherwise would be. Even if you don't allow any of my other arguments, even if you don't allow any of them. Imagine you're playing in the tank queue on flex just to farm passes, right? You've won a couple of games and you start getting a bonus SR for a win streak. What do? When you're tired, or maybe you can't be asked to try and win, or you come home drunk, you would otherwise go on a Smurf account in order to not lower your main account SR. Why wouldn't you just go on and farm passes by winning or losing, whatever comes? It's fine, doesn't matter. Just play the tank queue. It's fine. It's fine. So why did the priority pass fail? It failed because it created poor incentives for players. Firstly, due to the large number of passes given for a win, it became a completely mandatory system and incentivized players to always have a pass in order to queue. Secondly, the large maximum amount of passes caused players to build up passes over the first couple of weeks of it being released. Some players were lost through unwillingness to farm, some players were lost through unwillingness to farm a second time, and quite a lot of the players paid any tank queues straight back into the system. Thirdly, by forcing people to play that off role, they created players that were de facto smurfing when it came to certain player qualities that were easily transferable from tank to the others. Fourthly, because the only thing that actually matters to players farming passes is getting the most passes per hour, DPS players were clearly incentivized to lean into whatever selfish skill set they could find. And I'm going to say very clearly here, I don't just mean Roadhog, I mean characters like Roadhog. I mean being selfish, hoarding resources for yourself, all that type of thing was completely incentivized by the system. Fifthly, losing was made much less impactful because they offered a consolation prize. And finally, lastly, when players don't care about their tank SR, when players get a pass anyway for losing, and when every game they win makes it harder to farm passes in the future, they at best become incredibly volatile, unhelpful players that are awful to play with. At worst, they may actively try and sandbag games because that's been incentivized by the system. So what happens to the good player, the tank lover, the player that exists solely for Reinhardt? The player whose experience we by all rights should be catering to and actively try and improve if we ever want the tank queues to be reasonable. What happens when they're being put into a game with Roadhog players that don't care about the outcome as long as they're getting passes, are liable to throw the games if anything is said to them, and most importantly are actually better at the video game than you and can completely control the game if they're properly supported? And in the cases that you don't get to play this absolutely miserable game with Roadhog on your team, do you know what you've got instead? Oh god, please no, I'm so bored. Please let me play the game. I don't want to play Orisa. Please, Jeff, anything but this miserable experience. I'd quit the game. Or if I didn't as a tank player, I'd sure as hell use up all those passes. If I had 10 years and infinite resources, I couldn't, on purpose, come up with a system better designed to lower the tank player base numbers, increase the DPS queue times, and to torpedo the game in a way where the only way out is a transition to the inevitable 5v5 format. So yes, the Priority Pass is a system that is the worst thought out and implemented in the history of Overwatch, and is a massive part of why the game died. And if we repeat these mistakes, it'll happen again. As to what we can do so that the mistake doesn't repeat, you'll have to wait till another time. Because if this playtest goes well, as I think it's going to, and we do return to 6v6, we're going to have to put this form to rest once and for all. Thanks to everyone for your time listening to me. As you've gathered, these videos take a ridiculous amount of time for me to create, which is way more than is truly necessary. If you want to see me in the meantime, I have a second YouTube channel where I upload stuff like stream clips, commentary, reactions to other streamers being a bit silly, and as always, we run a 6v6 pug on the weekend with, what is it now, almost 13 heroes reworked in that mode. Thanks for your time, have a great day.